Right into workshop agenda 2A, presentation and discussion regarding phase 2 of the development code update. Ms. Mandy, you are up.
Okay. Good afternoon, planning and zoning commission members. Some of you heard this last week, so I apologize if it's repetitive, but it was important to both meet with our community advisory committee meeting and then also do this group as well. So some of it will sound familiar to those of you. I will, I think we're going to try to keep it pretty high level for like the first 30 minutes and then make sure that we leave enough time for questions at the end. I just want to make sure, Roger, are you able to hear everything all right?
Thank you, Mandy. Yes, I did. It's breaking up a little bit, but sound is fine. Thank you. Hopefully you hear me clearly too.
Yes, you sound clear to us. All right, awesome. So Roger and I are going to tag team it. Roger Eastman is with Logan Simpson, who is the consultant on our code update. They were consultant in the first round as well. This is phase 2, and we're planning to do 3 phases. So we will jump right in. So purpose of just this overview, we're going to give kind of the focus areas of what phase 2 is about. For context, just because it came up last week and I thought it was a fantastic question, we did complete phase 1 in February of this year. I'm going to just give a very brief summary of kind of what phase 1 included, just to maybe refresh our memory. And then that way you can kind of compare what this phase is all about. So phase 1, pretty much all articles of the code were touched. I think some of the main priorities were we created some new zoning districts. We renamed some zoning districts to be more consistent with the rest of the valley. So our formerly SF districts became R1 districts. The new districts were our industrial mixed-use district, or IMU, and then our SFF district. We created base districts out of our CMP and PADs. They were formerly overlay districts. And then we also codified the intent to try to phase out some of the obsolete districts, although that didn't ultimately take place in phase 1. There were some minor use changes, some minor dimensional standards changes. For some design standards, we added design standard language for those new districts that were created. And then a lot of it was either removing process language from the code that didn't really need to be there, that would be better suited for a separate process guide, as opposed to being directly within the code itself. And then moving language around to other sections of the code where it made more sense. New definitions, just clarifying words. So, overview of phase 1, just refresher. But for this presentation, we're going to go into what our focus areas are for phase 2, and then we're going to take a slightly deeper dive into the signage portion, just because that section is the most advanced as far as the drafting stage is gone, and then we'll talk about kind of the next steps and timeline of overall update. The purpose, very similar as for phase 1, is just to make sure that this is modernized. The previous kind of code was, what, 10, 15 years probably before it had been, undergone a major update. So this is just making sure that it fits today's needs and just make sure that it reflects current best practices and that there's consistency with any state and federal law changes. And then an effort to streamline things where we can, where it makes sense. The focus area memos, so these are the actual focus areas of this update. This is a collaborative effort with Logan Simpson, so staff is taking on some. They're doing the bulk of these focus areas. But we're going to talk about uses, signs, our development and design standards, our land subdivision, and then streamlining. And then there's a few other changes that fall outside of that. Definitions, of course, affected by all of those focus areas. And then just because you can't probably read this, but this is just kind of how we've been organizing all of our staff comments. So internally, we have collaboratively gone through and identified areas of improvement, and then this is how we're tracking it. with our consultant just to make sure that we are all on the same page. So for use regulations, our first focus area, we are updating and trying to modernize our use table. We have created a few new uses to try to fit what today's needs are, renamed a few uses that just have better naming conventions for today. We've added a BESS category, which is the battery energy storage system, which ended up being a hot topic at our community advisory committee meeting last week. And then a lot of the efforts to modernize Table 3.1-1, it has actually just been to reorganize it and make it a little bit more user-friendly for both staff and anybody that's applying for an actual permit or something with the development process. So just reorganizing it into more logical categories, breaking things out into their own categories where it makes sense. And then wherever possible, there's just a couple identified uses on the slide there, reducing the number of CUPs or conditional use permits where we already have use-specific standards in place or will have those specific standards.
We can't hear you.
We really have a hard time. We had a hard time hearing you in that.
We can't hear you.
And we can't hear you.
Shout?
Yes.
Okay, I will shout. I can do that. Thank you for
Maybe she
telling me.
can, maybe lower on
You
this.
could, yeah, maybe slide a little down too, and I'll close the door.
I thought it was just my old ears, but.
No, you're fine. I always wonder how well I project, and especially in this kind of room.
Yeah, no, we might need like a microphone.
All right. Tell me again if you can't hear me. So,
Thank you.
yes. Okay. Do you want me to go back and restate anything? Okay.
Good, man.
Okay. I'm happy to answer questions though. Okay. Continuing on our use regulations, we also are going to be updating our use-specific standards to be consistent with the table changes that are being made, reorganizing those to fit whatever order that goes in, updating our telecommunications use standards to be consistent with federal law. I mentioned BESS for the battery energy storage systems. That's a new section under the use standards that we're writing. And then there's a couple other on here. We're adding some spacing standards for sexually oriented businesses, otherwise largely not changing that. And then for ADUs, that is something that we are going to be incorporating into the code starting, so in the March update, this update. That was a recent state statute change that mandated how cities need to treat accessory dwelling units. So that's something that is going to be folded into this update and it won't be separate. And then I am going to let Roger talk about signs because this is definitely his area of expertise. So take it away, Roger.
Thank you, Mandy, members of the Planning and Zoning Commission. It's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon. As Mandy said, I'm Roger Eastman, Senior Associate with Robin Simpson Design. And we've been assisting the city, as you've heard, with these phases of the zoning code update. So let's pause just for a moment and go back in time to June of 2015 to try to understand why such significant changes are required to the city of Buckeye's zoning code. And honestly, every city and town across the country has had to take a very close look at their sign regulations. I won't go into the details of the case, but essentially, Pastor Green from the Good News Presbyterian Church was putting the signs out, as you see in this image here, advertising when you had church services. And the town of Gilbert at the time had regulations that affected different types of temporary signs. It has regulations for political signs, for example, ideological signs, and then, in this case, temporary directional signs relating to a qualifying event. And for each of these different categories of temporary signs, they have different rules. Where they could be placed, how long they could be placed, what size they needed to be, and so on. And after a long series of lower court decisions and battles, it finally made its way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court determined that the Town of Gilbert's zoning regulations or sign code regulations were content-based. So if you go to the next slide, Randy, content-based.
We couldn't hear him. That it was determined that Gilbert's sign ordinance was what?
Content-based.
Okay.
Roger, if you can speak up just a little bit more, I know it's probably difficult with how our audio works, but.
That's no problem. Is that a little better? I've moved the microphone right up to my chin. Oh, well, that's what it is. So, content-based regulations, if you look at the next slide, are sign regulations where you have to read the sign. What does the sign say to know what type of regulation to apply? So if we go to the next slide, please. In this case, a political sign is clearly for Waldo in this solar example, right? And the regulation is based on the content of the sign. What we're trying to get to is a content-neutral regulation, which is based on time, place, and manner regulations, and you'll see this in the examples I'll present. So in this case, it's a freestanding sign, or it might be a building-mounted sign, or a window sign, or so on. And you regulate the sign based on time, place, and manner, not the text that's on the sign. That's the fundamental distinction here between content-based and content-neutral. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see some examples of Buckeye's existing Chapter 511 compared to how we are rewriting the proposed Chapter 511. So anything dealing with real estate open houses no longer is going to be in the new, what will be called a portable sign. Well, grand openings will become temporary signs, either banner signs or feather banner signs and so on. Political signs are regulated now by Arizona revised statute. They essentially are portable signs, and we've got regulations that allow them to be in place for consistent with Arizona statute. Next slide, please.
Wait, can we go back a slide? What was the business signs? Okay, all right, I didn't get that part. Okay, thank you.
So yeah, business signs. So okay. Moving then on to the biggest change that you'll see in this chapter is a complete reorganization to make it honestly more user-friendly, easier to follow, not only as a lay member of the public, but you as regulators on the Planning Commission, the City Council, staff to administer it, and users to apply the code. We've updated the purpose statements so that they're content neutral. We've added a new substitutions and interpretations language. This is consistent with best practices that basically allows a commercial message to be replaced with a non-commercial message without the need to trigger any sign permits. We've also significantly shortened the list of exemptions because you want to make sure that you regulate everything as much as possible. The exemptions, of course, do apply to government-related signs, addressing signs, and things like that. We've provided a cross-reference to the sign permits section of the existing code, and at staff's request, expanded the comprehensive sign plan provisions to provide a lot more flexibility than your current code provides at this time. For example, if a developer wants to propose or a business owner wants to propose slightly different standards or a different sign type than the code currently will provide, with a comprehensive sign plan, there'll be the ability to allow for that additional sign. Let's go to the next slide, please. We also reorganized the sign standards that apply generally, and we've created two categories here: the general restrictions for location, display, and prohibited sign types, and then general requirements. So instead of having sign area defined in the definitions, or sign height defined in the definitions, we've inserted new illustrations and included this in this general requirements section right up near the beginning of the code. All the standards for sign illumination are included in this section. Sign structure and installation is essentially minimal standards, but a cross-reference to your building code, where the building official has to make sure that the structure meets any code requirements, and that's some provision for maintenance of the sign in the long term. Next slide, please. So one of the first things we did is organize the sign types into building-mounted signs and freestanding signs. And then we showed in this table, if you go to the next slide, you'll see detail, how those sign types relate to the different zones within the city. So now a user can very quickly see that a awning sign, for example, is not allowed in the single-family residential zones or the ag zones. However, it is allowed in multifamily, the commercial zones, the industrial zones, and so on. So in one simple table, anybody can see exactly what signs are allowed where. And then you go into the details on the following pages. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to create, using very similar standards from what the city has today for area and height, and we're actually working with the city staff on some revisions to, in some instances, increase the amount of wall-mounted sign areas, and in the industrial zones, for example, perhaps reduce it. But we're going to create for each sign type, very simple, FAPC example, fix the ones you'll see in the final code. And then in a simple table, how big is the sign? How high is it going to be mounted off the ground? Where may be it placed? How many signs are allowed per business frontage or per business? Can it encroach into the public right of way? In this case, for the vertical projecting sign, yes. How is it illuminated, and so on? So we've done this for every one of the different sign types that you saw in the preceding table. We then move to the portable and temporary signs. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Oh, I'm so sorry. We've also, at staff's request, carried over the city's existing standards for digital billboards and electronic message display signs, and really just cleaned up the language, simplified it where necessary, made it easier for everybody to use and understand. Next slide, please. So for the temporary signs, as you call them now in your existing code, we've made a distinction between portable signs, those are signs that are very easily picked up and moved, compared to temporary signs that are more associated with being attached to the ground or attached to a building. The portable signs here do not require a permit. And the logic behind this is whether it's a sign type 1, like you see in the top of the image, the UV voting sign, that's a typical yard sign type 1. And it's used frequently by realtors, by politicians, by people advertising in the landscape business, and so on. Very difficult to get a realtor to apply for a sign permit. And honestly, we shouldn't do that. So the portable signs, the outside types 1 and 2, the window, the apron, the feather banners, they're all allowed without permits. The back banners that were attached onto the wall of the building, the outside type 3s you see at the bottom there, the large balloons and inflatables that the city allows, they would all require some kind of temporary sign permit. Let's move to the next slide. At the request of the city, we took a very comprehensive look at the standards for model home complexes. And the city was very kind to provide some research that they've come across. City staff is reviewing the draft that we have created on this section, but the idea was to provide some flexibility in the regulations for model home developers to ensure that they sell their homes in a quick slide on signs is non-conforming signs, and in this section we provided clarification on the non-conforming signs rules and added some new incentives for the replacement of a non-conforming sign. Very difficult to require all non-conforming signs to be removed, but you can certainly incentivize their replacement by providing different standards.
What would be a non-conforming sign?
Good question, thank you. A non-conforming sign would be a sign that does not comply with the new regulations once adopted. So we're assuming it was legally approved under the old code, and it doesn't comply with the standards of the new code. The other way to look at it is sometimes referred to as a grandfathered sign.
What's the name?
I'm sorry, is there an example of something that might be currently?
In the city?
Yeah, that,
One that comes to top of mind is the cafe sign, 2535 across the street. It's taller, freestanding sign, taller than what our code currently would allow. It's also a pole sign, meaning it's a narrow pole with a top that just kind of hangs off of it. Our freestanding signs now are mainly monument signs that are wider and a little bit more decorative.
that clarifies. Thank you.
What's an incentive? What's an example of an incentive?
Of an incentive?
So, yeah, I can jump in and answer that. Many years ago, I worked on City of Flagstaff sign code, and City of Flagstaff, as you know, is a Route 66 city, and so there were many signs that were built in the 1970s that didn't comply with any of the city's current requirements. Unfortunately, because they were so old, many of them were starting to fail and needed to be replaced, but they were still being maintained and kept on the particular property. So the idea was, we said, look, if you reduce, and I don't remember the exact numbers, forgive me, if you reduce the sign height by 10% or 20% or whatever that threshold is, we're allowing you to build a sign that's bigger than the new standard. So it's reducing the non-conformity without bringing it into complete compliance with the new standard in the code. And when I was zoning administrator up there, I processed 2 or 3 different applications where a very large sign was reduced in area and height such that it was still bigger than what the code required, but it was a much safer sign. We changed out the electrics to make the electrics a lot more energy efficient, made sure that they weren't as bright, things like that. So they were holding on to the sign, keeping it there without having to come into full compliance. Let's move to the next section, if that's all right with everybody. And we took a look at new standards that originally were called standards for big box stores. And these are design standards for buildings and site design. The better term really is large format retail, and what we're in the process of creating is new site design and building orientation standards with updated architectural standards. We've looked at a number of codes across the country and found some really good standards that are very applicable to Buckeye. Obviously dump those that don't make any sense. At staff's request, we will be thinking about building entrances relative to driveways and parking areas in the street to make sure that the building entrance to the large format retail store is easily identifiable. We're also looking at new standards for industrial development, also based on site design and building orientation. We've looked at the landscaping section. Staff has provided us with some recommendations for landscaping in the medians in public rights of way. And we're suggesting some improved buffer standards between uses based on some other work that we've done. In terms of lighting standards, we've updated the term used in the code to fully shielded, which is a best practice. term rather than full cutoff. Essentially, it means the same thing, but consistent with the city's desire to modernize and update the code, we're using a more typical technology these days. And we're introducing lighting classes so that you have different levels of lighting and different types of lighting based on the use. For example, a car dealership would need full color rendition, so that would become lighting class 1, whereas a single family home, lighting class 2, where full color rendition around the outside of your home is not as important. And then lighting class 3 would be lighting that you'd see for uplighting architecturally on a building or in a tree, or allowing for holiday lights and so on. Next slide, please. We also are working with the staff on moving the traffic mitigation section to the engineering standards, and staff is working with the traffic department on this recommendation. And we're working now on the circulation and connectivity standards to update and improve them to make sure that pedestrians and cyclists have the same safety considerations in public right-of-way as do automobiles. We're adding new standards for bike parking and storage, both short-term and long-term, and including e-bike charging stations, which is a best practice that you'll see today. And then throughout the code, lots of minor cleanups to simplify language, make it easier to read, and as part of that work too, will be new illustrations throughout Article 5. That concludes my part of this. Back to you, Mandy.
Thank you, Roger. Before I move on to the next focus area, I just wanted to add one little thing that isn't formally, I guess, part of the focus area under their scope, but we are doing some very minor revisions to our residential design standards. That's probably an effort that needs to be broken out and done more thoroughly at a different time, but we're looking at things that are more important to go ahead and tackle right now. We've had some issues with our garage dominance language that's in Article 5 as it applies to single-family detached design reviews. So we're taking a look at that now because it has been identified as a priority item. And then also in the last update, we had looked at single-family flex standards. We're going to be modifying that to be more build-to-rent focused and making sure that those standards are clarified to be everything that we need to conduct a design review for build-to-rent projects and do it consistently.
And before we move on, can I ask a question?
Yes.
It has to do with the last slide about the lighting standards. This new thing is people are putting lights around their house, not just at Christmas anymore. Will they have to get a sign permit for that? Or a lighting permit? I don't know if there's such thing as a lighting permit. Will that?
Roger, were you able to hear the question?
Yeah, I did hear the question, and no, we're working under the assumption that you would not need a lighting permit for exterior lighting. Honestly, it's not something we've discussed with staff. The city of Flagstaff, we had concerns with Blackstone, with the US neighborhoods that we do out there, as a specific lighting permit, but that's a unique case. I don't think you need a lighting permit if it's lighting would be considered as part of regular site plan review. And if somebody's in violation of an existing building for which no permit was required, then that becomes an enforcement issue and an education issue on the part of the city.
Thank you, Roger.
I'll move on to our next focus area, which is land subdivision. This one is relatively simple. We're primarily wanting to update it so that way terminology and subdivision types are consistent with state statute. We just want that consistency to be there with that statute provision. And then some of you might be aware there have been some state statute changes over the last few years regarding plat approvals and bodies that can approve a plat versus whether or not they can be done administratively. The trend at the state has seemed to be that both preliminary plats and final plats, they're looking to make those more administrative, more streamlined. So that's one of the items that we have identified as far as possibly allowing more administrative or staff level approvals. We're looking at what other jurisdictions are doing and just trying to keep current and understand what is the trend and what makes the most sense for Buckeye. But that is as it relates to plats in this case.
Well, at one point, it seemed like the legislature was trying to get rid of P&Z altogether, so just bypasses.
Well, that's not our goal. Definitely not. But let's see, as far as streamlining, oh, this already on to the next one. So this is our next focus area, which is streamlining. This encompasses kind of the whole code, but for this slide, this is more Article 8, which outlines a lot of our review and approval procedures for different types of applications. I said at the beginning that the first phase attempted to remove a lot of language that was process-based rather than actual standards or findings of fact or things that really belong in code versus things that can be taken out and turned into a process guide. So we're still doing that, making sure that we've separated that cleanly. And then we are talking still about design review, kind of taking a look at the preliminary plat and the final plat administrative reviews and seeing whether it makes sense to apply that as well to our design review processes. Our strictly design review processes, so not a site plan, those already are generally an administrative thing, but we could also look at whether or not we should revisit the thresholds on our site plan approvals as well. But again, that's an item that we're looking to try to be consistent with what other jurisdictions are doing and picking what makes the most sense for Buckeye as well. And then outside of Article 8, Article 4, which is our dimensional standards, we're not doing major changes to this right now, but we are looking to try to clean up and clarify anything that isn't already clarified, relocating any terms that really belong in the definitions, and then overall applied to the code, not just this article, we're looking at the style guide. We created a style guide Logan Simpson created a style guide for us that is a great way to make sure that the code sounds like it was written in one voice. And so just to maintain kind of a level of professionalism when you read the code and make sure that everything is very consistent, we're going to be applying that kind of at the end just to make sure that it all sounds cohesive and consistent. And then I think, one item not on the slide, but I did want to make sure that I brought up. We are potentially talking about not doing CMPs or community master plans moving forward and condensing it to just planned area developments. We're talking about the best way to make that work. Our intent is to protect any existing CMP or CMP that's in the process right now. It wouldn't harm those applications in the future or prevent their ability to modify their CMPs or amend. But we've realized that we're kind of the only jurisdiction that uses that language. We want to be consistent. And the only difference in our code between CMP and PAD is really just a size differentiation. So it just makes sense to try to streamline that further and not have them separated.
Do we still get the development agreement with that and everything? To try to get better stuff from the developers?
Can I answer that one?
Sure.
So CMPs and PADs historically, many of those were required to have development agreements. But even though a majority of them will likely still continue to have those because the larger ones have a significant amount of infrastructure and things of that nature, we found that many of the PADs and some of the CMPs that went through amendments didn't really require a development agreement because that's a lot of attorney time, our attorney time, where some of those just really didn't require one. So we removed it from the code and it's now discretionary. So if the city engineer, our attorneys, fire department, and others require a development agreement, it'll be initiated by the staff versus just a standalone requirement.
Yeah, because I can't remember the one up north of Festival,
Yeah.
the city got a lot of that.
Yeah, North Star Ranch is one of the projects that many of you are familiar with that project. We went through a process to get that approved, and that was a very robust development agreement. That was kind of a combination of city initiated as well as developer driven. But that development agreement protected the city long term to allow us to ensure that we have fire stations, appropriate amount of financial support to staff certain stations depending on development. And many of those development agreements also they're all case by case, but some of them are triggered. Like a fire station may be required after the 1500th home is built. Those are some of the things that you might see in these larger master plan communities. But we have some that have gone through amendments or like smaller scale PADs that just really didn't require that robust type of an agreement. And we don't want applicants or the city to use our resources on things that we don't necessarily need to do. So we'll still continue to do those, but they'll be discretionary on a case-by-case basis. Thank you.
Okay. This one's not exactly a focus area, it kind of relates, I guess, to streamlining, but definitions, I've hit on that a couple times in the presentation, just as we identify the need to define things further or move definitions from other locations in the code, we'll be updating this section to make more sense and to be better organized, specifically with signs. We'll be adding subsections so that way any signage related definitions will be added in one place.
What is a BESS?
That is,
Storage system.
Better electric?
Battery,
Oh,
electric.
battery,
storage system.
okay, that's what it is.
That's what all the hubbub was at your.
Last week.
yes. Yes, which is a great segue, because, so that was one of the most recent steps for this process was last week we had a meeting with our Community Advisory Committee, which includes kind of a lot of the development partners plus many of you guys. So we appreciate the participation in that. We are working on drafts, which will be circulated for review next month or January, ideally sooner rather than later, and as each section is completed. We're going to continue working internally like we have been on finalizing those edits. And then our goal for adoption is to come back formally for P&Z review at sometime in either February or March, and be adopted by March with the City Council. So, and then Municode is the one place where this will all be housed and updated, so that'll come a little bit later as they get our code and update it, but that'll be where it'll be housed once everything is said and done.
This is a silly question.
Probably not.
Is this going to be a printed book or is this going to be a website you guys go to? How big is this code book? Is it?
Yours is like, what, that big right now?
Yeah.
Like, he has a printed copy on his desk, that's why I asked. I don't know that we're gonna print copies, but I imagine there's some staff members that once we're all done with phase 3, they'll probably want to print a copy for their desk.
I'm old school, I like printed copies.
Nothing wrong with
I
that.
think about 200 pages is what the current code is.
Oh, okay. I imagined it 1,200 pages.
We don't want that either.
No, and I, the search part of that would be important.
Oh, that was a good question. I think that pretty well concludes everything. I'm the, I guess, official point of contact on everything, so that's why I'm the one presenting today. And yeah, I look forward to hearing what you have to say today, but also, if there's anything that comes later, hearing those comments and questions later as well.
Early on in the slides, there was a marijuana business or something, because at one time the city took a stand about not having any dispensaries. So have they backed off on that? Are we preparing?
A little bit of both.
Okay.
We had a meeting with the council in 2022, I believe. And there are certain types of things with the new law with the recreation that you can do, grow, you can test and that sort of thing. And we brought it down to just medical marijuana and then a dual license facility, which is it has a medical marijuana and it has recreation. Those two are allowed. The days of the week were extended to 7 days a week, but the hours are still 9 to 5, which is probably going to detract from anything coming into here.
Why would they do that? To distract?
I'm not really sure, but yeah, but it is going to be able to do that. Probably the best chance of getting one of these facilities in our city is on a county island.
And the code only allows for them in industrial, right?
Industrial too, the highest industrial.
Isn't there one going on Jackrabbit in the county island?
Yeah, county.
The Wales one?
Bart had a slide that he presented to council that was really neat. It showed all the cities and their marijuana, I guess that's where I would say it, is that the right word, marijuana?
Yeah.
Marijuana standards. And there were some cities that were very conservative that just did the bare minimum that the state requires by law. But some other cities actually allowed a little more, maybe not as conservative. They allowed a little extra, maybe a little less buffer, and more zoning districts that are available, those types of things. But our response from council at the time was that they wanted to be more on the conservative side. So I think Surprise was also very conservative with some of the West Valley cities. So likely that'll continue to be the case. But we haven't had a lot of folks knocking on our doors. You know, that hasn't been a high demand use in Buckeye. In some cases, when the state opens up licenses, there are certain periods, and it's just random when they do it, when they open up licenses to allow for dispensaries, you'll get like a flood of people, like within a 30-day period, just calling. But there is an opportunity in Buckeye, but they have to go through a zoning process, primarily to establish a zoning district that's compatible with the use.
So you talked about the things going more administrative.
Yes.
And how does that affect the public meetings that you have to have for some of these things?
So for the two items that are, that we identified as possibly going more administrative than they are now, for site plans, currently that does not require a hearing, and we only, I think the threshold is 75,000 square feet, so larger projects go to P&Z at a public meeting. So it's not a hearing, and then anything that's less than that threshold can be approved administratively right now. So we're looking at whether or not it makes sense to increase that threshold. So largely that process doesn't change, it's just that threshold would change. For preliminary plats, that is similar in that it does not require a public hearing as well. So it would largely not change in the sense that instead of it, if it were to go administrative up to a certain point perhaps, it would be approved very similarly like a site plan would by administrative staff versus at a public meeting at P&Z. Final plats are approved by council, and I think they're usually on consent, so that doesn't change things by and large either.
P&Z approved site plans. I didn't think it went to council, or that's just some of it.
Yeah, Mandy just was talking about final plats.
Oh, final plats.
Those are-
Sorry if that wasn't clear. Final plats go to council, the other two.
I heard site plans.
Nope. You're good.
I know some people that don't think they get enough information, and not even having those public hearings, or not hearings, but meetings would make people upset that not hearing them, but if that's state law.
So currently, maybe one thing to add to that conversation is currently rezones, like the property rezones from commercial to industrial, those require a neighborhood meeting, outreach, newspaper ad, the whole 9 yards, general plan amendments, major general plan amendments. But the pre-plats historically, pre-plats and site plans even over the last 10 to 12 years didn't require any type of neighborhood meeting because those are by right uses. So uses that are allowed by right in the zoning district, the use is already approved by council through ordinance. So it's just a matter of ensuring that the neighborhood or the site plan meets our design standards. And so I think that's why it's important why it's really important that we're doing our development code update now, is because we hear from commissioners, city council, residents on things that they have issues with. Industrial buildings should have more of this. Certain landscape areas should have more of this. Medians should have landscaping. And so those types of things, the more we have that in our code, the more it makes those processes a lot more streamlined to be able to implement those standards. But those types of things really don't change too much from the way we process it today from a community outreach perspective.
I think it's important to talk about the why. Why are we considering reducing the threshold for administrative types of actions. And like everything that we do, it's a matter of competing the best we can with adjacent neighbors for development. And some of those cities don't require those processes already, so they can advertise a faster process to somebody. Certainly want to take neighborhood feedback and public into consideration. So that's why it's a balance that we're trying to figure out what is that proper amount, for preliminary plats, for instance. 100 lot plat, relatively small. Could that be approved administratively? I think, Floreo and Terravella, something with 5,000 lots. I don't think we have any intent to make that something that wouldn't come to Planning and Zoning Commission. Similarly with the site plan, Mandy said 75,000 square feet is currently that trigger. That was a somewhat arbitrary number that was chosen. Should that be the number? Should it be 100,000? That's basically what we're evaluating.
What does 75,000 square feet look like? Is that like Fry's, or is that?
75,000 square, a typical Fry's, not like a Fry's Marketplace, is about 50 to 60.
Not far off.
Good guess. In those strip mall areas or pretty much everything, address numbers on the building, is that in code or is that in somewhere? It drives me nuts when, my navigation gets me someplace, but I can't find the number on the building. And I would like, since we're new and we can do that,
So
have numbers on it.
that is actually a function of the fire code. Fire code requires buildings to have address numbers in a visible location from the adjacent street. They have to be a certain size and color, contrasting color. So if you're noticing buildings that are not doing that well, let us know, and maybe they're not meeting their code requirements.
Okay. That's a good answer. Back to the signs. Is the size still that bizarre formula of the length and width of the building times 14 toes and 6 hands, and that divided by your firstborn or whatever it is? I don't know.
I do think that the intent was to carry over much of our regulations regarding sign size, but instead just reorganize. However, we are going to be supplementing with more graphics and more instructions on how to calculate sign area, so it should be a lot more user-friendly for both us, the staff, and anybody else reading the code.
Just don't ask how three-dimensional signs are
Oh,
calculated.
gosh. That one, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. With a picture.
Sorry, Roger.
Do you have a Z dimension?
Now, well,
That's fine. We've actually clarified in the discussion, so hopefully it's better now.
what would a three-dimensional sign be? Something like turn?
Hobo Joe would be an example. If Hobo Joe was out in front of a Hobo Joe restaurant, yeah.
And not a piece of art.
Yes.
Because I lived through the Hobo Joe
Yeah.
controversy back in the 80s. And so I know,
Yeah.
I've lived through that. And so it was finally, after about 9 months of being tried in the local newspaper, it was decided that Hobo Joe was not a sign because it didn't say
Yeah.
slaughterhouse or something, because that's where he was in front of. He was a piece of art. So
There's a fine line.
We have approved a lot of signs in the planning and zoning in the last few months. Those signs that we have approved here, are they going to fit into the code that's coming out?
So those would be primarily comprehensive
CSPs.
sign plans. Yes, those would still be approved. I don't know, I'd have to look at those, I guess, to assess whether or not they would fit the standards that are being proposed in the update. But since by and large, we're not changing the standards a lot, rather reorganizing and redefining, probably. But by nature, CSPs already deviate from the base standards. So
Which
it's
is
not
why
going to
they-
invalidate them though.
Yeah, and the new code will still maintain the CSP procedures that if we want to propose signage in excess of what the code base allowance is, it would still go forward for P&Z's approval.
So when you guys go to planning school, you take a class, is planning 101 class, signs are bad?
I did not learn about signs in school, I'll tell you that.
Because businesses need signs, they really do.
I think there's been, and Roger might be able to speak to this even more than me, but just in my career, I think signs have gone from unrestricted in the 1950s and 60s, and you just had billboards everywhere and paint, every side of every building was painted with some sort of advertisement. And I think cities reacted to that and really limited, probably overly limited the signage that businesses were allowed. And then I think, you saw what the results were. Everybody kind of had a very similar looking sign. The creativity was lost in a lot of cases. So I think you now see cities maybe moving a little bit back in the old direction, trying to find a way to really encourage fun, creative signage, because it can really help, make an interesting place even more interesting. If you have Bobo Joe, for instance, or Westgate is a good example in Glendale. There's a ton of signage at Westgate, and it makes it feel like Times Square, kind of. So that's pretty neat. And to a certain extent, our Verrado Marketplace will have some of that kind of feel to it also. So yeah, I think we're starting to maybe go full circle to some degree. This doesn't go back to the unregulated sense by any means, but it still kind of establishes ways to be creative and allow for that.
There was even a book in school that I remember where it was a sign standard book. There's also a public safety aspect to it, where if the monument signs have big enough letters, people will slow down on a 45-mile-an-hour road and try to read which if there's 20 tenant spaces on a sign, they'll slow down to try to find which one they need to go to. But some cities will go to a maximum of 8 because they find that most people won't slow down if it's 8 or less. So there was like a traffic component to that too in some of the studies that most of the cities adopted with some of those large monument signs where you see the panels are a little bigger, but some of the older projects in the 80s, 90s you see in Phoenix, some of the panels are so small and you have like 50 of them that it's really hard to read from the road. So that all kind of adds to the formula, but we're starting to kind of meet in the middle where it works almost on both sides.
Yeah.
Maybe Roger had, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, to piggyback off of what Ken said about encouraging more creativity, I think that is one of the primary intents of us expanding what our comprehensive sign plan process does, is if we get a very interesting sign type that we haven't seen before, we don't want to automatically shut it down because, well, the code doesn't allow it. We want to make sure that it's clarified that there is a way for an applicant to pursue something fun and creative, even with our current provisions.
When you were talking about that, the example that popped into my mind was the Handy's, the restaurant in the old Handy's building, and that's the sign on the side of the building. I was little, that was the cooked.
Now a wonderful restaurant. It's good to not eat in there.
It is, except for when you go to look in the elevator,
Yeah.
the elevator shaft, that's very good.
I'm glad we're doing this because if Buckeye, keeping up with the rest of the cities, because if Buckeye doesn't do the right things, people are going to skip over us and go into the Tonopah area and Maricopa County land to the west of us. They're going to still use our infrastructure, but we're going to get no benefit out of it. So we got to get, if people are going to use our infrastructure, we got to get the benefit from it. So I know some people are like, oh, we got to stay rural, but if we have that we're not going to get the benefit. People are still going to go through it. We're going to still have the same traffic and the same problems. So might as well benefit from it.
That's how I feel about the marijuana businesses, because people are just going to go Cerebral Road and get it up,
That's where I get mine from.
I just want to point out for the record, Adam acted like he didn't know how to pronounce marijuana. That made me laugh a little bit.
There's a lot of names for it. You know?
Cannabis.
Yeah, cannabis.
One hearing is
I haven't seen this before.
So is there a deadline when people are required to take down temporary signs, such as election signs that are still up?
There's 30 days.
I don't know what
I
I'm
do.
saying, what is it?
I actually looked up the other
30
day.
days?
Weird, I remember that. No, election signs actually have to come down within 10 days of the election. So November 6th, 10 days after that, they have to come out of the right of way. So election signs are allowed in the public right of way. There's certain criteria for it, but it's 10 days.
Wait, aren't you on the school board?
Yeah.
Yes, and we're only 40 votes behind right now
Oh, wow.
Really?
for the elementary school override.
Oh,
And there's
that's-
still a few more,
Yeah. 'cause-
over 40 to be counted, so we're hopeful.
Oh, good.
Yeah, the ones, Adam's talking about, the rules are for public rights of way. If somebody has a Trump or a Harris sign on their front yard, there's no requirement that they ever take that down. They can keep that up as long as possible.
Unless HOA has a requirement.
Well, that's true. That's true.
What about if the city hall has one out here?
Those are all on city property. Those can all come down within 10 days. And if they don't take them down, we're allowed to remove them.
But not until 10 days.
I was
Correct.
surprised it was allowed.
We have to let them try to retrieve them.
I didn't think it was allowed on city property.
Yeah, the state law changed several years ago, 5, 6 years ago, to basically remove any restrictions other than for public safety. So you can't have it blocking traffic, can't put it in the street to block traffic. You can't have it too close to an intersection where you can't see around it. But other than that, they're pretty much allowed anywhere.
Yeah. We had to change our HOA rules about 4 years ago.
Yeah.
For the first time to allow political signs.
Oh, that's been a law for a long time.
They just enforced it about 4 years ago for HOAs.
Because I moved into my house 15 years ago, and when I first put my first political sign up, they told me I had to take it down, and I said, no, that's my freedom of speech. You can't not do that. And they never ever said another word to me.
Yeah, that's because it was you.
They knew you were.
They don't know. I'm nobody.
But you know somebody.
I know lots of people, but I'm nobody.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you for the robust conversation, great questions, even better answers.